Sleep is one of the few constants that unites all human beings across time. Kings, peasants, monks, and merchants, no matter their wealth or status, all needed to rest. Yet the way people slept in the past reveals so much more than just physical rest. It tells us about their homes, their fears, their beliefs, and how they navigated the long, uncertain hours of night. The Middle Ages, a period roughly spanning from the 5th to the 15th century, was a world without electricity, without digital clocks, without artificial light. The rhythms of sleep were dictated by the seasons, by the sun and moon, and by deeply rooted cultural practices. And while many today imagine medieval people sleeping uncomfortably on hay piles inside dark, smoky huts, the truth is far more complex and far more human. In this long exploration, we'll walk through medieval homes and castles. We'll step into monasteries and village inns. We'll listen to the sounds of the night, and we'll discover how sleep was shaped by religion, class, medicine, and even folklore. So lie back, take a deep breath, and let's begin. A quiet journey into the world of medieval sleep. In order to understand how people slept in the Middle Ages, we must first understand how they perceived night itself. The medieval world was governed by the natural cycle of day and night. When the sun set, it was not merely the end of the day. It was the beginning of a time filled with mystery, fear, and sacred quiet. Unlike our modern world, where the flip of a switch can illuminate the darkest room, medieval darkness was absolute. Once the sun disappeared below the horizon, light came only from fire, from torches, candles, oil lamps, or hearths, and for many those light sources were expensive or limited. Most people, especially the poor, went to bed shortly after sundown. In summer, that meant a later bedtime, but in winter it could be as early as 5 or 6 p.m. The wealthy might stay up longer, reading by candlelight, talking by the fireplace, or even playing music. But even they were constrained by the practical realities of darkness. Darkness was not just a physical condition, but also a spiritual one. Medieval people believed that the night was a time when evil spirits were more active, when demons could roam, and when temptation was at its strongest. This belief wasn't limited to folklore. It was woven into the teachings of the church, the writings of scholars, and the fears of ordinary people. Because of this, many nighttime routines included prayers for protection, blessings over the bed, or the placing of holy items nearby, such as crosses, relics, or sprigs of protective herbs. In villages and towns with churches or monasteries, people also measured time by bells. Church bells rang at fixed intervals, not just to mark the day's prayers, but also to define the hours of night. One of the most important nighttime hours was matins, a set of prayers often performed in the middle of the night, around 2 or 3 a.m. These monastic practices reinforced the idea that the night was not simply for sleeping, but also for reflection, vigilance, and spiritual defense. Even secular people were aware of these rhythms. Hearing the distant bell of a monastery in the silence of the night reminded villagers of the passage of sacred time. Without streetlights, the medieval night could be dangerous. Traveling after dark was risky. Roads were unlit, bandits could hide in forests, and animals prowled freely. In towns, watchmen patrolled the streets, calling out the hours and checking for fires or disturbances. In homes, the fire in the hearth was often allowed to die down, sometimes covered in ash to keep embers glowing until morning. Children were warned to stay indoors after dark, and some people even slept with weapons near their beds, not uncommon in frontier areas or times of unrest. For those who could afford it, shutters were closed tightly and doors were barred with wooden beams. The night, though quiet, was never fully trusted. The timing of sleep was tied directly to sunset and to the season. In the absence of artificial light, people became closely attuned to the cycle of daylight. In winter, the length of darkness could stretch to 15 or more hours. Yet people didn't necessarily sleep through all of it. This leads us to one of the most fascinating and now almost forgotten aspects of medieval sleep: the practice of segmented sleep, or biphasic sleep. But we'll explore that in depth in the next chapter. Sleep, like so many other aspects of medieval life, was shaped by social status. Where and how you rested depended not only on your wealth, but also on your profession, your household size, and even your gender. Let's step into the sleeping spaces of peasants, nobles, travelers, monks, and everyone in between. For the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages, the peasants, laborers, and rural poor, sleep happened in one-room homes, often shared with livestock. These humble dwellings, made from timber, wattle, and daub or stone, had dirt floors, thatched roofs, and very few windows. At night, the door was shut, the fire banked, and the whole family would settle in for the night. There was usually no separate bedroom. Parents and children slept together, often near the hearth, the warmest place in the house. Beds might be as simple as a raised wooden platform or just a pallet on the floor made of straw, reeds, or dried leaves. The mattress was typically a cloth sack, known as a tick, stuffed with hay or chaff. Sometimes animals were brought inside during the night, especially in winter. Their body heat helped warm the space, and they were safer from predators or thieves indoors. Though modest, these sleeping arrangements were practical. They offered warmth, protection, and a sense of communal closeness that modern bedrooms have lost. Now let's climb the stone steps of a medieval castle. Here, in rooms decorated with tapestries and candlelight, we find the noble bedchambers, larger, more private, and far more luxurious than anything a peasant could imagine. The bed was often the most expensive piece of furniture in the household. A wealthy lord or lady might sleep in a four-poster bed made from oak or walnut, draped with thick curtains to retain heat and block out drafts. The mattress would be stuffed with feathers instead of straw, far softer but also more prone to pests. Underneath, a woolen blanket, possibly fur-lined, added warmth during long, icy nights. In noble homes, bedchambers were not always entirely private. It was common for servants to sleep in the same room, sometimes on benches, mats, or near the fireplace, and noble children might sleep in the same chamber as their parents until they came of age. Across all social classes, bed sharing was normal, not just for couples, but for entire families. In peasant homes, everyone might sleep side by side on a large shared pallet. In castles, siblings often shared beds, and guests might be offered space in a noble's chamber if needed. Even in inns and taverns, strangers were often required to share a bed with one or more fellow travelers, a practice that seems unthinkable today but was once a fact of life. In fact, the idea of a bed being a private, personal space is a relatively modern invention. For medieval people, beds were spaces of warmth, survival, and practicality. Life on the road in the Middle Ages was uncertain, and so was the sleep that came with it. Travelers often stayed in inns, which ranged from respectable lodging houses to rough, noisy alehouses with straw on the floor. In rural areas, travelers might sleep in stables, barns, or even under the stars, using cloaks for blankets. Pilgrims on religious journeys often slept in church porches, monasteries, or hostels run by religious orders. In all cases, personal space was minimal. Travelers frequently shared rooms, beds, and even blankets. The priority was shelter, not comfort. Monks and nuns lived according to strict rules. Their sleep was limited, structured, and deeply tied to religious routine. Monks usually slept in communal dormitories known as dormitoriums. These large halls had rows of simple wooden beds or pallets separated by small partitions or curtains. Silence was required. No talking, no distractions, and certainly no indulgence in soft mattresses or luxury. They were expected to sleep modestly, sometimes even fully clothed, ready to rise for night prayers at set hours. In some austere orders, monks slept on bare boards with only a blanket or cloak. Sleep was seen not as a pleasure, but as a necessary pause in a life devoted to God. Medieval buildings, even castles, were cold and drafty. Windows had no glass, only shutters or oiled cloth. To fight the chill, some people used bed warmers. Pans filled with hot coals slipped between the sheets before lying down. Curtains around the bed served more than just decorative purposes. They kept out insects, blocked wind, and trapped the sleeper's body heat. In wealthier homes, the entire bed might be enclosed in thick, insulated curtains, creating a small, warm chamber within the room. Beyond comfort, the medieval bed held symbolic power. It was a place where children were born, where couples consummated marriage, and where people died. In noble households, a bed could be passed down as an heirloom, a symbol of family wealth and lineage. What if I told you that for most of human history, people didn't sleep in one long stretch through the night? In the Middle Ages, the standard sleep pattern for many was not one continuous block of rest, but rather two distinct phases separated by a quiet period of wakefulness in the middle of the night. This now forgotten custom is known as the two-sleep system, or segmented sleep. This segmented sleep wasn't seen as strange or problematic. In fact, it was considered normal, even ideal. Historical sources, run from court documents to medical texts, mention first sleep and second sleep as common parts of daily life. The period between first and second sleep was known as the watch or the waking. It was not a time for labor or noisy activity, rather it was a gentle hour, quiet, private, and contemplative. Some people used the time for prayer, reciting psalms or whispering devotions by candlelight. Others may have engaged in intimate conversation or written in journals or letters, though literacy was limited. Doctors of the time actually encouraged couples to conceive during this interval, believing the body was more relaxed and receptive then. In rural villages, neighbors might visit one another for quiet talk or shared drinks by the hearth. This wasn't considered unusual or intrusive. It was part of the accepted rhythm of night. The two-sleep pattern is well documented in medieval writings. In Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, a character refers to rising after his first sleep. In the 13th century, the medical text Trotula suggests that after waking from first sleep, the body is best suited for digestion and lovemaking. Even in legal documents, testimonies sometimes specify whether an event happened during first sleep, between the sleeps, or in second sleep, an indication that courts and officials recognize these phases of the night. Modern scientists believe that segmented sleep was a natural biological response in the absence of artificial light. In a world without screens, lamps, or bright indoor lighting, the human body responds more directly to circadian rhythms, especially melatonin production, which rises with darkness. Researchers in the 1990s conducted experiments simulating medieval light conditions. Participants, after a few weeks, began naturally sleeping in 2 blocks with a period of calm wakefulness in between. This suggests that biphasic sleep is not a disorder, but rather a deeply ingrained biological possibility. So what happened? By the 17th and 18th centuries, the practice of 2 sleeps began to fade. As urban areas developed and artificial lighting became more common, oil lamps, gas lights, and later electricity, people began staying up later and compressing their sleep into one long stretch. The Industrial Revolution accelerated this shift. Workers now had rigid schedules and sleep had to fit into shorter nighttime windows. The quiet, meditative hours between sleeps became a luxury few could afford. Gradually, society forgot that it had ever been different. Today, some people experience middle-of-the-night wakefulness and worry that it's a sign of insomnia. But for medieval people, waking up in the dark was not a problem. It was expected. This shift in perception may explain why modern sleep issues are so common. We treat sleep as something to conquer, a strict, uninterrupted block, rather than listening to the natural rhythms our bodies may still remember. Some sleep researchers now advocate for a more flexible approach to rest, inspired in part by how people slept in the Middle Ages. Imagine you fall asleep just after sunset in a wooden house lit by embers. A few hours later, you stir gently. You rise, stretch, and sit by the hearth. You whisper a prayer, sip warm ale. Maybe stroke the family cat curled at your feet. Outside, the village is silent. A soft wind moves through the trees. This time, between first and second sleep, is yours alone. Eventually, you return to bed, your mind calm, your body ready. Second sleep comes easily, and when the sun begins to rise, you awaken, rested and whole. In the Middle Ages, sleep was not something to master. It was something to flow through like a quiet tide. As we continue our journey through medieval nights, we'll now explore what people did during those long hours in the dark. From holy prayers to hushed conversations, from dreams to fears. In the quiet space between first and second sleep, the medieval night came alive. Not with noise or chaos, but with small, meaningful actions. Unlike today, where waking at night is often a cause for anxiety, medieval people accepted it as a normal rhythm, a part of their bodily and spiritual routine. What then filled these gentle hours? The answer depends on who you were, where you lived, and what your soul or body needed. For many people in the Middle Ages, the hours of darkness were seen as a sacred time, especially the space between sleeps. The church viewed the night as a time when the world was still, when distractions were gone, and when one's heart could be turned more easily toward God. Many people woke to say their prayers, often by candlelight or beside the bed. Common folk might murmur the Pater Noster, the Lord's Prayer, or a few Hail Marys, while more devout individuals read from books of hours, small collections of psalms and meditations designed for lay people. Clergy and monks had structured nighttime prayers, such as matins or vigils, often held in cold stone chapels at 2 or 3 in the morning. But even ordinary villagers believed that prayer at night was powerful, a defense against demons, temptation, and the unknown forces of darkness. Not all nighttime activity was spiritual. Some used this time to complete small household tasks that didn't require daylight. Women might mend clothing, twist yarn, or prepare herbs for the next day. Men might sharpen tools, check on livestock, or stoke the fire so it didn't go out before dawn. In winter, a person might simply sit by the hearth, wrapped in a cloak, warming their hands and listening to the wood crackle. This wasn't labor in the modern sense. It was gentle maintenance, a way to pass the time with quiet purpose. The midnight hour offered a rare chance for private conversation, especially in larger households where space and quiet were rare commodities. Couples might talk softly about their children, their fears, or their hopes. Parents could speak with one another in peace after a long day of work and noise. Some couples made love during this time, a moment of closeness and calm before drifting into second sleep. Doctors and theologians of the time even encouraged intimacy between sleeps, believing the body was most relaxed and fertile then. Sometimes people simply woke up and got a snack. In wealthier homes, a servant might keep warm ale, mulled wine, or even meat pies near the hearth. In peasant homes, families might share leftover porridge, bread with lard, or a cup of herbal tea prepared earlier. It wasn't a full meal, just a way to warm the stomach before returning to bed. Hot drinks were valued not just for comfort, but also for their medicinal properties. Herbs like valerian, chamomile, or rosemary were believed to calm the nerves and promote restful dreams. Among the literate, which mainly included clergy, nobles, and some merchants, the midnight interval was a time for reading scripture, copying texts, or private journaling. Books were rare and expensive, and reading by candlelight was hard on the eyes. Still, many devout people used this time to study religious texts or to reflect on their day in silence. Some monks were required to copy books even at night, and monasteries often had strict schedules that included nocturnal scriptorium work. The quiet between sleeps was also a time to sit in simple stillness. There was no rush, no schedule. The mind was free to wander, to reflect on dreams, to think about loved ones, or to whisper prayers for the dead. Dreams, in fact, were taken seriously in medieval society. They were seen as messages, sometimes divine, sometimes demonic. People often pondered their meanings while sitting awake at night, especially if they had dreamt something vivid during first sleep. Medieval dream books, known as Somnial Danielis, were sometimes consulted to interpret symbols from the subconscious world. Though it may seem odd to modern ears, some people actually left their homes during this period. A neighbor might visit another by torchlight, quietly knocking, bringing warm wine, or sharing stories. In towns and cities, night watchmen patrolled the streets. They carried lanterns, rattles, or horns and announced the time with chants or bells. Some people, especially travelers or guards, were paid to stay awake. And for those suffering from illness, grief, or insomnia, the stillness of night was the only companion. In the quiet stone walls of medieval monasteries, sleep was not only a necessity, it was a discipline. For monks and nuns, the night was not simply for rest, but a time to engage with the divine, to battle temptation, and to follow a rigid spiritual schedule. Their sleep was shorter, more interrupted, and far more controlled than the sleep of ordinary folk. Yet for them, this rhythm of waking and sleeping was not a burden. It was a holy pattern. Let's step now into the cloister and listen to the sacred silence of monastic sleep. This meant that monks and nuns rarely slept through the night. They would go to bed early, wake in deep darkness, gather in chapel for matins, and then either return to bed or remain awake for silent meditation. Time itself was measured not by clocks, but by the sun, stars, and bells. Each hour of the night was sacred, and each moment was accounted for. Monastic dormitories, called dormitoriums, were large communal sleeping halls. There were no private rooms. Each monk had a simple bed, often a wooden frame with straw or hay stuffing, and sometimes only a mat on the floor. Beds were spaced closely, sometimes separated by wooden screens, sometimes not at all. Each monk had a small area for personal items, a cloak, a book, a wooden cup or bowl. The rules of most orders forbade luxury. No feather mattresses, no warm pelts, no soft cushions. Silence was strictly observed. Monks and nuns slept fully clothed, often in their habits, ready to rise at the bell's call. In the deep silence of the monastery, long before the rest of the world stirred, the bell rang. Monks would rise without speaking. They moved through the cold stone corridors, barefoot or in simple sandals, guided only by lanterns or moonlight. They gathered in the choir or church, forming silent lines, and chanted psalms in Latin under the vaulted ceilings. This was matins, the heart of the night's worship, a solemn prayer to keep spiritual darkness at bay. These nighttime prayers could last from 30 minutes to 2 hours, depending on the feast day, season, or specific rule of the order. Afterward, some monks would return to sleep. Others would meditate, read scripture, or begin manual labor. In some monastic rules, lauds, The next prayer followed shortly after matins, meaning sleep might be broken into 2 brief intervals. Why did monks interrupt their sleep so willingly? Because for them, sleep was not the ultimate priority. Salvation was. They believed that the night was a time when the soul could be closest to God. By waking in the darkness, they were imitating the vigilance of Christ, who prayed alone in the garden while others slept. They also saw broken sleep as a form of asceticism, spiritual training. Denying the body's desire for rest was a way to conquer temptation, purify the heart, and focus the mind on heaven. Even in dreams, monks were warned to guard themselves. They prayed for protection from lustful or sinful visions and confessed disturbing dreams to their superiors. Despite their broken sleep, monks were not sleepless. Most monastic rules allowed for 6 to 8 hours of total rest, split into 2 or 3 sessions. Work in the monastery was balanced with prayer, reading, and silence. Days began early, often before sunrise, with manual labor such as farming, copying manuscripts, or preparing food. To compensate for the night prayers, monks often took short naps or rested after none, the afternoon hour around 3 p.m. Unlike today's constant stimulation, the monastic rhythm was slow, repetitive, and intentional. Even fatigue was embraced, as a reminder of the soul's dependence on divine strength. Imagine the monastery at night. Thick stone walls, cold air, and narrow windows high above. Candles flickering in alcoves, the gentle shuffle of sandals on the floor, and the low, echoing chant of psalms rising into the vaulted ceiling like smoke. There were no distractions, no noise, just the breath of monks, the turn of parchment pages, and the ever-present sense of God's closeness in the darkness. In many ways, the monastic approach to sleep offers a counterpoint to modern habits. They slept less but rested more deeply. They woke during the night but used the time with purpose. They saw sleep not as escape but as part of their moral and spiritual discipline. While few today live like monks, their quiet rhythms remind us that nighttime doesn't have to be chaotic. It can be meaningful, ordered, and even sacred. In the modern world, sleeping is often seen as a private, even solitary act. We retreat to our bedrooms, we close doors, we draw curtains. But in the Middle Ages, sleep was rarely done alone. From peasant cottages to roadside inns, from noble homes to bustling monasteries. The act of sleeping was often a communal experience, shaped by practicality, warmth, and survival. Let's now explore the world of shared beds, crowded rooms, and the quiet intimacy of sleeping side by side. In most medieval homes, especially among the peasantry, the entire household slept in one room. There were no private bedrooms, no separate spaces for parents, children, or servants. A typical family, parents, several children, and sometimes elderly relatives, would share a common bed or lie together on straw mattresses spread across the floor. Children often slept at the feet of their parents or huddled close together under a shared woolen blanket. In winter, sleeping in a group helped conserve body heat in homes with no insulation or central heating. Babies were kept close to the mother's breast for nursing, while toddlers might sleep curled beside older siblings. This closeness wasn't merely tolerated, it was necessary both for warmth and for emotional comfort. Even in wealthier homes, sleeping alone was rare. Noble couples often shared large beds, though not always out of love or romance. Sometimes marriages were formal arrangements, and bed sharing served symbolic or reproductive purposes. Servants, particularly nursemaids or body servants, might sleep at the foot of the bed or on benches nearby. Trusted attendants often had their own mats or stools in the same room in case their masters needed something during the night. Bedchambers were not always private. They could be sites of both intimacy and political negotiation, especially in noble households. If you were traveling in the Middle Ages, you didn't book a private room. In most towns, inns offered communal sleeping arrangements, often with several guests per bed. Inns were few, beds were fewer, and demand was high. As a result, travelers, and even total strangers, one would sleep shoulder to shoulder, separated only by cloaks or agreed boundaries. There are legal records from medieval courts where disputes arose from strangers rolling over onto each other, snoring or stealing small belongings during the night. In some cases, inns rented beds by the half-night. One guest slept from dusk to midnight, another from midnight to dawn. While modern ears may cringe at the thought, for medieval people this was simply how travel worked. Despite the lack of privacy, there was a sense of ritual to shared sleep. People knew their place in the bed, parents in the center, children at the edges. Guests deferred to hosts, elders to superiors. It was a microcosm of medieval societies, structured, respectful, and rooted in necessity. Sleeping together fostered a kind of emotional intimacy. Even in silence, the warmth of another body beside you provided comfort, security, and a sense of connection. Of course, shared sleep had its downsides. Lice, fleas, and other pests spread easily in shared bedding. There were unwanted noises, odors, and disturbances. Children kicked in their sleep. Adults snored, infants cried. And not every bedfellow was welcome. Legal and religious texts from the time contain warnings about impropriety, especially in mixed gender or non-familial arrangements. Monasteries, for example, took great care to separate monks from one another, even if they slept in the same dormitory, often insisting on physical space or curtains between beds to avoid temptation. To sleep beside someone was not just practical. It was often a social signal. Who you slept with reflected your status, your trust, and your role within a household. It revealed relationships between parent and child, lord and servant, friend and guest. Even in death, people were often buried with others, lovers, family members, or fellow monks, as though the closeness of sleep extended beyond the veil. So what can we learn from the practice of shared sleep in the Middle Ages? That for most of history, sleep was not isolated. It was communal, physical, and deeply human. People didn't shut themselves away at night. They gathered close, for warmth, for safety, for kinship. The rhythm of sleep was shaped by togetherness, not solitude. And in that closeness, in that fragile shared space of nighttime breathing and dreams, lay the quiet heart of medieval life.